what exactly does the ADA do, and who does it protect? So we're looking here at 42 USC section 12101. Okay, so just to be clear here, I want to discuss the law, the ADA law, where it comes from, what the sources of law are, and we're going to get into how you can find the specific obligations applicable to your business here in just a moment. But for right now, let's discuss exactly what the sources of the law are. So we have the ADA itself, and the ADA itself is a law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which means that it was passed by the Congress. Okay, and it's at 42 USC section 12101, and a lot of times you'll see ETSEC, ETSEQ, which basically just means and etc. or and what follows, and basically there are a number of sections, and we'll be looking through them today. But the law itself has certain terms, including that the Department of Justice will issue regulations for further enforcement of the ADA, and we're going to look at that very carefully. And those regulations are at 26 CFR Part 36. So that's 26 CFR is the Code of Federal Regulations. So that is a regulation that's been passed by the Department of Justice. And 42 USC, United States Code, is the law that was passed by Congress. We don't have to get too far deep into these weeds, but the bottom line is Congress passed the law. It's at 42 USC 12101 and the following sections. It directed the Department of Justice to issue regulations, which was done and which we're going to look at in detail. And then the law and the regulations have been interpreted by different courts, different federal courts, and we're going to look at some court opinions as well. And those are things that also have to be taken into consideration, especially in developing areas like applicability of the ADA to websites when we're trying to figure out how to comply and what is the smart thing to do in terms of meeting obligations and avoiding any possible litigation. But let's dive straight into let's start from the beginning here. So the ADA was passed based on the congressional findings, among others, that you see here. And you can Google 42 USC 12101 and read this for yourself. It's very simple. And in fact, in our course materials, I'm going to include a document that has links to important places online, and I'll have a link to the actual text of the ADA itself. But the congressional findings included that historically, society has tended to isolate and segregate individuals with disabilities, and despite some improvements, such forms of discrimination against individuals with disabilities continue to be a serious and pervasive social problem. Unlike individuals who have experienced discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, national origin, religion, or age, individuals who have experienced discrimination on the basis of disability often have had no legal recourse to redress such discrimination, and the continuing existence of unfair, unnecessary discrimination or prejudice denies people with disabilities the opportunity to compete on an equal basis and to pursue those opportunities for which our free society is justifiably famous, and the costs the United States billions of dollars in unnecessary expenses resulting from dependency and non-productivity. So here we have the findings that underlie or underpin or lead the Congress to decide that it needs to act on this issue. There is a problem that has been identified. The problem is laid out here largely, and there needs to be a solution. And so as a result, we have the purpose laid out of the ADA, which is to address the problems identified in the findings, right? So we have the problems that are being addressed in the findings. And now, so what is the purpose of the law? The purpose is to provide a clear and comprehensive national mandate for the elimination of discrimination against individuals with disabilities, to provide a clear, strong, consistent, enforceable standard addressing discrimination against individuals with disabilities, to ensure that the government plays a central role in enforcing the standards established in this chapter on behalf of individuals with disabilities, and to invoke the sweep of congressional authority, including the power to enforce the 14th Amendment and to regulate commerce in order to address the major areas of discrimination faced day to day by people with disabilities. So we know what the problem is. We know the purpose of the law to address that problem. And the next slide. And as a result, there's a general rule that's laid down by the ADA. And again, you can see here, I generally, in these slides and in this class, will have the citation to whatever it is that I'm talking about or have up on the screen laid out so that anybody can look at it. And these items will also be linked in course materials that I provide. So anybody can go and just look this up. I mean, this is obviously publicly available. This is part of this is a law of the United States. It's very easy to find. You could just Google this. But so the general rule that's laid down in order to address these problems and to meet the purpose of the law that we just read is that no individual shall be discriminated against on the basis of disability in the full and equal enjoyment of the goods, services, facilities, privileges, advantages, or accommodations of any place of public accommodation by any person who owns, leases, or leases to or operates a place of public accommodation. Okay, there's actually a lot to unpack there. But let's just break this down. And then we're going to go a little deeper into each of the elements that I'm about to break down. But let's discuss this here for a minute. So no individual shall be discriminated against on the basis of disability. So you cannot discriminate against anyone based on their disability in the full and equal enjoyment of the goods, services, facilities, privileges, advantages, or accommodations of any place of public accommodation, okay, by any person who owns, leases, or leases to or operates a place of public accommodation. So we're protecting people from being discriminated against on the basis of disability by any public accommodation. So that is who the law applies to. It prohibits discrimination by places of public accommodation against the disabled. And for purposes of the law, a place of public accommodation includes any person who owns the place of public accommodation, leases or leases to the place of public accommodation. And of course, leases to is the operative word for commercial landlords, because landlords are often sued along with their tenants in these cases where we're talking about physical barriers to access, or operates a place of public accommodation. So if someone is operating in a space and they're operating a place of public accommodation, but they don't happen to be the tenant or the landlord in the space, there nonetheless is liability created for them. So again, we have to understand here who is disabled, what is the basis of disability, what is disability under the law, what is a place of public accommodation, and who exactly is responsible for any discrimination by the place of public accommodation. I hope this isn't getting too complicated. It's actually really very simple. We have to know who is disabled, we have to know what businesses are covered, and we have to know who can be sued in relation to in terms of their relationship to that business. And let's go through that as simply as we can. So let's start with, what is the term disability? So the term disability means, with respect to an individual, a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more life activities of such individual, a record of such impairment, or being regarded as having such impairment. Now, really, from the practical perspective of a business that doesn't want to be sued, what we are really worried about, of course, you should be worried about and concerned with all of it, but generally, these lawsuits, in my experience, are brought by people who actually have a physical or mental impairment. So, a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So what is a major life activity? Let's go down here to 2A, and it says, for purposes of paragraph 1, major life activities include but are not limited to caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, hearing, seeing, eating, sleeping, walking, standing, lifting, bending, and it goes on. And again, anybody who wants to can actually look up the law at 42 U.S.C. section 12102, sub 2A, to read this entire paragraph. But the bottom line is a physical or mental impairment that limits your ability to do any of these things. And of course, what you see largely in these lawsuits are an inability or a limitation on the ability to walk with regard to wheelchair users in particular. And a lot of the regulations are geared toward making spaces wheelchair friendly, as we'll see in a moment. And of course, to see as it relates to a lot of the website cases, as we'll also see here shortly. So the bottom line is, if somebody is limited in their ability to do any of these things, including seeing and walking, then they are a disabled person for purposes of the law. Now, the law does get a little bit nuanced sometimes with respect to whether, for example, someone who only temporarily can't walk is considered disabled. I don't want to get into that. I don't want to get too deeply into the weeds. The bottom line is that business owners need to know that if somebody is limited in their ability to do any of the things that are set out in this section, they are considered disabled under the law, and that and considering people who are limited in that way disabled is the prudent is really generally going to be the correct thing to do. So we move on now here to slide number 9, which I thought was interesting. Now this is our first look at the actual regulations. So you'll see here it says 28 CFR Part 36, and you can look this up quite easily. If you type into Google 38 CFR Part 36, section 36.101, and we're looking right now at sub B. And again, I'll have a link to the entire regulations. It's all free. It's all online. This document we're looking at is a product of the United States government. It's a regulation issued by the government. Doesn't cost any money to look up. In fact, quite the contrary. You're supposed to look at it and understand what your legal obligations are. The primary object, I'm just looking at this bit that I've highlighted here. The primary object of attention in cases brought under the ADA should be whether entities covered under the ADA, and we're going to discuss in a minute what those entities are, have complied with their obligations and whether discrimination has occurred, not whether the individual meets the definition of disability. The question of whether an individual meets the definition of disability under this part should not demand extensive analysis. So what does this tell us? I can tell you what it says to me. To me, it says that the focus of the law is eliminating discrimination against the disabled. And so if a case is brought on the basis that discrimination is occurring against the disabled, the primary focus should be on whether or not that's true and not whether or not the person is or is not fitting within the definition of disability. Now, as a practical matter, only people with disabilities who encounter barriers applicable to their disability have standing to sue, and that gets a little bit more complicated. But I just want to highlight this to show you that really the primary focus of this law is in eliminating barriers to access that a disabled person might run into. And we're going to discuss what some of those barriers are here. And that should really be, that's really what the law is focusing on. And small businesses, medium businesses, all businesses in general who are subject to Title III of the ADA should really put their primary focus on eliminating barriers to access